The ice hanging from my eaves like jagged teeth should have been the least of my problems that February morning, but apparently, in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision of Minneapolis, Minnesota, it was grounds for a $200 fine. I discovered this delightful piece of information when I came home from my construction job to find a bright orange envelope tucked into my front door. My name, Walter Vance, was printed in bold letters across the front, along with the dreaded words HOA violation notice stamped in red ink. I remember standing there in my work boots, still covered in drywall dust, staring at that envelope like it might bite me. Inside, the notice was typed up all official looking, complete with photographs of my house taken from multiple angles. The images showed the icicles hanging from my gutters and the ice dams that had formed along the edges of my roof. According to the letter, signed by one Patricia Morrison, president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, my property was in violation of Section 4.7 of the HOA covenant, which stated that all homes must maintain a neat and aesthetically pleasing appearance, and that dangerous or unsightly conditions must be remedied within 7 business days of notification. I had exactly 1 week to fix the ice problem, or the fine would double. The thing was, I had been trying to deal with the ice. Minnesota winters were brutal, and this particular February had been especially harsh. We had gotten 3 feet of snow in 2 weeks, followed by a brief warming period that caused everything to melt slightly, then refreeze into solid ice when the temperature dropped again. Half the houses in the neighborhood had the same problem. I had seen icicles hanging from the Johnson's place 3 doors down that were at least 4 feet long, like frozen stalactites. But apparently, I was the lucky one who got photographed and fined. I called the number listed on the letterhead that evening. A woman answered on the 3rd ring with a crisp, Meadowbrook Heights HOA, Patricia Morrison speaking. "Hi, this is Walter Vance from 4782 Birchwood Lane. I just got a violation notice about ice on my eaves." "Yes, Mr. Vance. We sent that out this morning. The ice buildup on your property poses both a safety hazard and violates our aesthetic standards." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. "I understand the concern, but this has been a really harsh winter. I have been trying to manage it, but the ice keeps forming faster than I can remove it, and I have noticed several other houses in the neighborhood with the same issue. Mr. Vance, whether other properties are in compliance is not your concern. Your property is the one we are addressing today. You have 7 business days to remedy the situation. Can I ask why my house specifically was targeted? I mean, if this is a neighborhood-wide issue, would it not make more sense to address it collectively?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had taken on that particular tone that I would come to know very well over the next few months. It was the sound of someone who was used to being in charge and did not appreciate being questioned. "Mr. Vance, we received a complaint about your property from a concerned neighbor. As HOA president, it is my responsibility to investigate all complaints and enforce our community standards. The photographs clearly show a violation. I suggest you use the next 7 days wisely." She hung up before I could respond. I spent that evening researching ice dam removal methods online. The general consensus seemed to be that the safest long-term solution was to improve attic insulation and ventilation to keep the roof cold and prevent the freeze-thaw cycle that caused ice dams in the first place. But that was a major project that would cost thousands of dollars and could not be done in the middle of winter with 3 feet of snow on my roof. The short-term solutions were either to manually chip away the ice, which was dangerous and time-consuming, or to install heat tape along the eaves and gutters. Heat tape, also called heat cable, was basically an electrical heating element that you ran along the edge of your roof to melt channels through the ice and allow water to drain properly. It seemed like the most practical solution. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store and bought 200 feet of heat cable, along with the clips and hardware needed to install it. The guy at the store, an older fellow named Doug who had been working there for 30 years, assured me it was a common solution in Minnesota. "Half the houses around here use heat tape in the winter," he told me as he rang up my purchase. "It is not pretty, but it works. Just make sure you plug it in on a GFCI outlet and unplug it in the spring." I spent the entire weekend installing the heat cable. It was miserable work, balancing on a ladder in 15-degree weather, running the cables back and forth along my eaves in a zigzag pattern and down through the gutters. My fingers went numb even through my insulated gloves, and I had to keep coming inside to warm up every 20 minutes. But by Sunday evening, the system was installed and plugged in. Within 48 hours, I could see the difference. Channels of melted water ran through the ice, dripping steadily from my gutters instead of building up into dangerous dams. The icicles that had hung like frozen daggers began to shrink and disappear. I felt pretty good about myself. Problem solved, crisis averted, HOA satisfied. I should have known it would not be that simple. The second violation notice arrived exactly 9 days after the first one. This time, Patricia Morrison did not even bother with the mail. She showed up at my door at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, just as I was heading out to work. She was exactly what I had pictured when I talked to her on the phone. Mid-50s, blonde hair cut in that severe bob that seemed to be standard issue for HOA presidents everywhere. Wearing a puffy North Face jacket and boots that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She held a tablet in her leather-gloved hands, and her expression suggested she had just discovered something deeply offensive on my property. "Mr. Vance, I presume?" "That is me. Can I help you?" "I am Patricia Morrison, HOA president. I am here about your recent modifications to your home's exterior." I blinked. "You mean the heat tape? I installed it to fix the ice problem you fined me for." "Yes, well, that is precisely the issue." She tapped her tablet screen and turned it to show me another set of photographs. These showed my house with the heat cables visible as black lines zigzagging across the white painted eaves. The installation of external electrical equipment was not approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Additionally, the appearance of these cables violates Section 3.2 of our covenants, which requires that all external modifications maintain the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You are joking." "I assure you, Mr. Vance, HOA covenants are not a joking matter. You were required to submit an application to the Architectural Review Committee before making any external modifications to your home. This includes the installation of cables, satellite dishes, external lighting, or any other visible changes. But you fined me for the ice. I fixed the ice. Now you are fining me for fixing the ice." Patricia's expression did not change. "You were fined for allowing a dangerous and unsightly condition to persist on your property. The solution you chose creates a different violation. You should have consulted with the HOA before proceeding." "So what exactly am I supposed to do? The ice was a problem. The heat tape fixes the ice." "But the heat tape is also a problem. What is the approved solution here?" She tapped her tablet again. "The Architectural Review Committee meets on the first Tuesday of every month. You can submit an application for the heat tape installation, and they will review it. In the meantime, I am issuing a warning notice about the unauthorized modification. If you do not either remove the cables or receive approval for them within 14 days, there will be a fine of $300. The first Tuesday of the month is not for another 3 weeks. That is past your 14-day deadline. That is unfortunate timing, but it does not change the requirement. You could remove the cables and reapply your original solution to the ice problem, then resubmit an application for next month's meeting. My original solution, I did not have one. That is why there was ice in the first place. Patricia tucked her tablet under her arm. Mr. Vance, I understand this is frustrating, but rules exist for a reason. The architectural consistency of Meadowbrook Heights is what maintains our property values. If everyone just made whatever modifications they wanted, the neighborhood would descend into chaos. I am sure you can appreciate that. She walked back to her white Lexus SUV before I could respond, leaving me standing in my doorway at 7:30 in the morning, already late for work, trying to process what had just happened. I called my friend Marcus that evening. He had dealt with HOA issues in his previous neighborhood before moving to a house outside the subdivision boundaries. I figured he might have some advice. "Dude, you need to document everything," he told me. "Every conversation, every letter, every fine." These HOA people can be relentless, and they love finding tiny violations to squeeze money out of homeowners. Cover your ass. But this is insane, right? Like objectively insane. Of course it is insane. But being insane does not make it illegal. Those covenants you signed when you bought the house, they are legally binding. The HOA can enforce them however they want, as long as they follow their own procedures. So I am just stuck. Not necessarily. You need to play their game. Submit the application. Show up to the meeting, be polite and professional. Most of the time, these committees will approve reasonable requests if you go through the proper channels. They just want to feel like they have power. I took his advice. That weekend, I downloaded the architectural review application from the HOA website and spent 3 hours filling it out. It was 8 pages long, requiring detailed descriptions of the modification, measurements, photographs, a site plan showing the exact location of the installation, and a justification for why it was necessary. I had to provide the brand name and model number of the heat tape, the electrical specifications, and even the color of the cables. For the justification section, I wrote a detailed explanation of ice dams, how they formed, why they were dangerous, and why heat tape was the recommended solution by roofing professionals throughout Minnesota. I included printouts from the state's Department of Commerce website about ice dam prevention, citations from roofing contractor associations, and even a letter from Doug at the hardware store confirming that heat tape was a standard solution used throughout the Minneapolis area. I submitted the application 2 days later with a check for the $75 application fee. Yes, they charged $75 just to review your request to make modifications to your own property. The waiting period was tense. Every day, I expected to see another orange envelope on my door. The heat tape was still installed and working perfectly. The ice problem was completely solved. But according to Patricia Morrison, I was living in violation of the HOA covenants every single day those cables remained visible. Finally, the first Tuesday of March arrived. The Architectural Review Committee meeting was held at the community clubhouse at 7 in the evening. I showed up at 6:45, wearing a clean shirt and carrying a folder with extra copies of all my documentation. The clubhouse was a fancy building at the entrance to the subdivision, with a workout room, a pool, and a large meeting room. I had never actually been inside it before, despite paying $200 a month in HOA fees. The meeting room had a long table at the front where 3 people sat. Patricia Morrison, a thin man in his 60s who was introduced as Gerald Peterson, and a younger woman named Susan Carter. There were 2 other homeowners present for their own applications. One was requesting permission to replace his wooden fence with vinyl, and the other wanted to install a backyard shed. Patricia called the meeting to order at exactly 7 o'clock and started with the fence application. The committee spent 15 minutes asking questions about the height of the fence, the exact shade of white vinyl, and whether it would match the neighboring properties. Eventually, they approved it with the condition that the homeowner submit photographs of the completed installation for verification. The shed application took even longer. Susan Carter had concerns about whether it would be visible from the street, even though the homeowner explained it would be in his backyard, behind a 6-foot privacy fence, completely hidden from view. They tabled the application and requested a site visit before making a decision. Finally, Patricia called my name. Walter Vance, application for approval of heat tape installation on primary residence. I stood and walked to the front, passing them the extra copies of my documentation. Patricia already had the original application in front of her, covered in yellow highlighted sections and handwritten notes. Mr. Vance, thank you for submitting this application. The committee has reviewed your request and we have some concerns. Gerald Peterson adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. My primary concern is the visibility of these cables from the street. The photographs you provided show black cables against white eaves, which creates a stark visual contrast. This disrupts the clean architectural lines that are characteristic of our neighborhood's aesthetic. I had prepared for this. I understand the concern about visibility, but the heat tape is only necessary during winter months when ice dams form. It can be removed in the spring and reinstalled each fall. Additionally, the alternative is to allow ice dams to form, which are not only dangerous but also far more visually disruptive than thin black cables. Susan Carter shook her head. But the covenant specifically requires that external modifications maintain aesthetic harmony. Could you not paint the cables to match the eaves? The cables are electrical heating elements. Painting them would potentially create a fire hazard and would likely void the manufacturer's warranty. These are designed to be installed as is. Patricia tapped her pen against her notes. Mr. Vance, I appreciate that you are trying to solve the ice problem, but the solution you have chosen is not in compliance with our architectural standards. Have you considered other options, such as improving your attic insulation to prevent ice dams from forming in the first place? That would require removing all the existing insulation, upgrading it, and improving ventilation. It would cost $15,000 to $20,000 and cannot be done in the winter months. The heat tape costs $300 and solves the immediate problem. Gerald Peterson made a note on his papers. Cost is not really the committee's concern, Mr. Vance. Our responsibility is to maintain the architectural integrity of the neighborhood. If every homeowner installed visible cables and wires on their houses, property values would decline. I felt my frustration building, but tried to keep my voice calm. But half the houses in this neighborhood have ice dam problems in the winter. Are you expecting everyone to spend $20,000 on attic renovations? Patricia's expression hardened. Other homeowners' situations are not relevant to your application. We are here to discuss your specific request. Okay, then let me ask this. What is the approved solution for ice dams? Because you fined me when I had ice, and now you are denying my application to fix the ice. What exactly am I supposed to do? The three committee members exchanged glances. Susan Carter spoke first. Could you install the heat tape on just the north-facing side of the house? That would reduce the visibility from the street. The ice forms on all sides of the house, not just the north side. Installing it partially would only solve part of the problem. Gerald Peterson flipped through my application. What if you used white cables instead of black? I researched that before purchasing. White heat tape is available, but it is significantly more expensive and harder to find. Also, within a few weeks of winter exposure, it would be stained and discolored anyway, so it would not maintain a white appearance. Patricia set down her pen with finality. Mr. Vance, I think we need to table this application until you can present a solution that meets our architectural standards. I would suggest consulting with a professional architect or designer who can help you develop an approach that solves your ice problem while maintaining the aesthetic integrity of your home. So, you are denying the application. We are tabling it, which means you can revise and resubmit. However, that does mean the installation currently on your property remains unauthorized. You will need to remove it. I could not believe what I was hearing. So I am supposed to remove the heat tape, let ice dams form on my house again, hire an architect to design some theoretical perfect solution, resubmit an application, wait another month for you to review it, and then what? Install whatever you approve next winter. That is the process, yes. And in the meantime, I am supposed to just accept whatever fines you issue for the ice. Patricia's expression turned icy. Mr. Vance, your tone is becoming inappropriate. We are volunteers trying to maintain community standards. If you have a problem with the process, you are welcome to review the covenants you agreed to when you purchased your property. I left the meeting feeling like I had been punched in the stomach. The fence guy got approved in 15 minutes, but my heat tape that actually solved a legitimate safety issue was tabled indefinitely. The next day, I received a formal denial letter in the mail, along with a notice that I had 10 days to remove the unauthorized heat tape or face a $300 fine. The letter also informed me that the original fine for the ice buildup was still valid since I had not resolved it through approved methods. I was looking at $500 in fines for trying to fix a problem they had fined me for in the first place. That weekend, I did something I probably should have done weeks earlier. I started talking to my neighbors. I walked up and down Birchwood Lane, knocking on doors and asking if anyone else had received violations or had problems with the HOA. What I discovered was disturbing. The Johnsons, 3 doors down, had been fined last year for leaving their trash cans visible from the street 15 minutes past the pickup time. The Rameyerses across the street had received a violation for planting flowers in their front yard that were not on the approved plant list. Old Mr. Chen, 2 blocks over, had been fighting with the HOA for 6 months over the color of his front door, which they claimed was not the approved shade of red, despite him having paint chips, showing it was exactly the color specified in the covenant. But the most interesting conversation was with my next-door neighbor, Linda Harrison. She was a retired lawyer who had lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 12 years, longer than almost anyone else in the neighborhood. Patricia Morrison is on a power trip, Linda told me over coffee in her kitchen. She was elected president 3 years ago, and since then, the number of violations issued has tripled. She drives around the neighborhood with her tablet taking photographs, looking for problems. Is there anything we can do about it? Linda smiled. Actually, there is. The HOA is governed by bylaws, and those bylaws include provisions for removing board members and challenging decisions. The problem is, Most homeowners do not know their rights, and Patricia counts on that. She uses the threat of fines to keep people in line. So how do we challenge her? First, you need to request a hearing before the full HOA board, not just the architectural committee. That is your right under the bylaws. Second, you need to document everything, which it sounds like you are already doing. Third, you need to gather support from other homeowners. If enough people are having problems with Patricia's enforcement, you can call for a special meeting to review the board's actions. Linda walked over to her bookshelf and pulled down a thick binder. This is my copy of the complete HOA covenants, bylaws, and meeting minutes going back 10 years. You should get yourself a copy. Know the rules better than they do. I spent the next week becoming an expert on HOA law. I read every page of the covenants, every section of the bylaws, every amendment and revision. I discovered that Linda was right. There were provisions for challenging board decisions, requesting hearings, and even calling for special elections. I also discovered something interesting in Section 7.3 of the bylaws. It stated that the HOA could not issue fines for violations caused by weather conditions or acts of nature unless the homeowner had been negligent in maintaining their property. Ice dams caused by extreme weather seemed like they should fall under that protection. I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board requesting a hearing to appeal both my fines and the denial of my heat tape application. I cited specific sections of the bylaws, included all my documentation, and sent copies to all 5 board members, not just Patricia. 3 days later, I got a phone call from a man named Richard Thompson. He introduced himself as the HOA treasurer and said he had received my letter. "Mr. Vance, I want you to know that not all of us on the board agree with how Patricia has been handling enforcement lately. Several of us have expressed concerns, but she is the president, and she controls most of the meetings. So you think I have a legitimate case? I think you are trying to solve a real problem in a reasonable way, and I think the board needs to consider that. Your hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from Thursday. It will be at the clubhouse at 7 in the evening. All 5 board members will be present, and you will have the opportunity to present your case." "Thank you. I appreciate that. One more thing, Mr. Vance. You should know that Patricia is not going to back down easily. She views any challenge to her authority as a personal attack. Be prepared for that." The hearing took place on a Thursday evening in late March. Winter was finally starting to loosen its grip on Minneapolis, and the temperatures had been above freezing for almost a week straight. Most of the ice on my eaves had melted away naturally, though the heat tape had done its job during the coldest weeks. All 5 board members were present: Patricia Morrison, Gerald Peterson, Susan Carter, Richard Thompson, and a woman named Joyce Miller who I had not met before. There were also about 15 other homeowners in attendance, more than I had expected. Apparently, word had gotten around the neighborhood that someone was challenging the HOA, and people were curious. Patricia called the meeting to order and explained that this was a formal hearing regarding my appeal of the violation fines and the denial of my architectural application. She asked me to present my case. I had prepared a presentation on my laptop with photographs, documentation, and citations from the bylaws. I explained the ice dam problem, showed pictures of the dangerous icicles and ice buildup, demonstrated that heat tape was the recommended solution by professional roofers and the state's Department of Commerce, and argued that the fines were inappropriate under Section 7.3 of the bylaws, since the ice was caused by extreme weather conditions beyond my control. Then I addressed the heat tape violation. I showed that the installation was temporary, removable, and served a legitimate safety purpose. I pointed out that the Architectural Review Committee had not suggested any viable alternatives, and that the requirement to hire an architect was unreasonable and cost-prohibitive. When I finished, Patricia looked distinctly unhappy. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. Does anyone on the board have questions?" Joyce Miller raised her hand. "I have to say, I find Mr. Vance's arguments compelling. I have had ice dam problems at my house too, and I was not aware that heat tape was an option. It seems like a practical solution." Gerald Peterson frowned, but the aesthetic concern remains. "The cables are visible and they detract from the neighborhood's appearance." Richard Thompson cleared his throat. "Gerald, with all due respect, they are only visible for a few months in winter, and they prevent a much worse problem. I think we need to be practical here. We cannot fine people for weather-related issues and then deny them reasonable solutions." Susan Carter looked torn. "But we need to maintain standards. If we approve this, what is next? Everyone installing whatever they want," I spoke up. "With respect, there is a difference between maintaining standards and being inflexible. Heat tape serves a legitimate purpose. I am not trying to paint my house purple or install a neon sign. I am trying to prevent ice damage and protect people walking past my house from being hit by falling icicles." One of the homeowners in the audience stood up. "Can I say something?" Patricia looked annoyed. "This is a board hearing, not an open forum." "Actually," Richard Thompson said, consulting his copy of the bylaws, Section 8.6 allows homeowners to speak during hearings if recognized by any board member. I recognize him." The homeowner was a middle-aged man named Dave Kowalski. "I just want to say that I have been dealing with HOA violations for 2 years now. I got fined for my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall. I got fined for having a crack in my driveway that I was already scheduled to repair. I got fined for having my Christmas lights up 3 days into January. At some point, this stops being about maintaining standards and starts being about collecting fines. I think Mr. Vance is being reasonable, and I think the board should approve his heat tape." Several other homeowners murmured in agreement. Patricia's face was turning red. "Order, please. This is getting off topic. We are here to discuss Mr. Vance's specific situation, not to air general grievances." But it was too late. The floodgates had opened. 3 more homeowners stood up and shared their own stories of what they felt were unreasonable violations and excessive fines. Linda Harrison raised her hand and pointed out several instances where Patricia had issued violations without proper board approval, which was itself a violation of the bylaws. The meeting devolved into chaos. Patricia kept trying to regain control, banging a gavel and calling for order, but the homeowners were energized now. Someone called for a vote of no confidence in Patricia's leadership. Someone else demanded a full audit of the HOA's finances to see where all the fine money was going. Finally, Richard Thompson stood up and raised his hands. "Everyone, please, let us handle this properly. First, let us vote on Mr. Vance's appeal, then we can address the larger concerns." The board voted 4-1 in favor of approving my heat tape installation and rescinding both fines. The only dissenting vote was Patricia, who looked like she wanted to explode. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "The heat tape is approved, but this board needs to have a serious discussion about maintaining our authority and standards. If we start caving to every complaint, this neighborhood will fall apart." Joyce Miller shook her head. "Patricia, we are not caving to complaints. We are being reasonable. There is a difference." After the formal vote, the meeting continued for another hour, as homeowners raised concerns about Patricia's enforcement practices. Richard Thompson promised to schedule a special board meeting to review all violations issued in the past year, and to develop clearer guidelines for when fines were appropriate. I left the meeting feeling vindicated but also concerned. Patricia Morrison had been publicly challenged and overruled, and based on what Richard had told me, she was not the type to forgive that easily. I was right to be concerned. 2 weeks later, I got a notice that my property was being inspected for code violations. Not HOA violations, but actual city code violations. Someone had called the city's code enforcement office and filed a complaint about my property, claiming there were safety issues. The inspector showed up on a Tuesday morning. He was a tired-looking man in his 40s named Steve, who clearly had better things to do than follow up on petty neighbor complaints. "Look, Mr. Vance, I have to inspect since a complaint was filed, but 9 times out of 10, these HOA neighbor dispute calls are bogus. Let me just take a look around and I will be out of your hair." He walked around my property with a clipboard, checking the foundation, the roof, the electrical meter, the gutters, everything. After 20 minutes, he came back to the front door shaking his head. "Your property is fine. Everything is up to code. Whoever called this in was wasting city resources. Can you tell me who filed the complaint?" It was anonymous, but it came through a real estate agent named Patricia Morrison. Says here she is concerned about property values in the neighborhood. Of course it was her. Steve handed me a copy of his inspection report showing no violations found. "Keep this for your records, and if you get any more harassment from your HOA, you might want to consult a lawyer. We see this stuff all the time, and sometimes it crosses the line into legitimate harassment." After he left, I called Linda Harrison and told her what happened. She was not surprised. Patricia is retaliating. That is actually a violation of the HOA bylaws. Board members are not supposed to use their position to target individual homeowners for personal reasons. What can I do about it? Document it. Keep the inspection report. If she keeps it up, you will have grounds for a harassment claim, maybe even a lawsuit. Over the next month, Patricia found new and creative ways to make my life difficult. I got a notice that my mailbox needed repainting, even though it was in perfect condition. I got a warning that my lawn was not being mowed to the proper height, even though I measured it, and it was within the specified range. I got a violation notice for having a package sit on my front porch for more than 24 hours, even though I had been at work when it was delivered and picked it up the same evening. Each notice was petty and technically within the HOA's enforcement authority, but the pattern was clear. Patricia was systematically harassing me, but I was not the only one. I learned that Dave Kowalski, who had spoken up at the hearing, was suddenly getting violation notices too. So was Linda Harrison. Patricia was targeting anyone who had challenged her authority. That is when things got interesting. Linda organized a petition among the homeowners calling for Patricia's removal from the board. Within 2 weeks, she had signatures from over 60% of the homeowners in Meadowbrook Heights. According to the bylaws, that was enough to trigger a special election for all board positions. Patricia fought it every step of the way. She claimed the petition signatures were not valid, that the bylaws did not actually allow for recall elections, that the whole thing was a conspiracy against her. But Richard Thompson, as treasurer, reviewed the bylaws and confirmed that the petition was legitimate. The special election was scheduled for the first week of May. In the weeks leading up to it, the neighborhood was divided. Patricia had her supporters, mostly older residents who valued strict rule enforcement and saw her as protecting their property values. But there was a larger group who were tired of the constant violations, fines, and petty enforcement. I decided to run for a board position myself. So did Linda Harrison, Dave Kowalski, and several other homeowners who wanted to see the HOA take a more reasonable approach. The night before the election, I got home from work to find that someone had filed another complaint with the city. This time, it was with the fire marshal, claiming that my heat tape installation was a fire hazard. The fire marshal's office called me that evening to schedule an inspection. When the fire inspector came out the next day, I showed him all the documentation for the heat tape, including the manufacturer's specifications, the installation instructions, and the fact that it was plugged into a GFCI outlet as required. He spent about 5 minutes looking at it before signing off that it was perfectly safe. "Who reported this?" I asked. "Anonymous tip, but I will tell you, Mr. Vance, filing false reports with the fire marshal is actually a crime. If you know who did it, you might want to consider pressing charges." That evening was the election. The turnout was huge. Nearly 200 homeowners showed up at the clubhouse to vote, the largest turnout for an HOA meeting in the neighborhood's history. Patricia gave a speech defending her record as president, talking about property values and standards and the importance of strict enforcement. She was polished and confident, clearly expecting to be re-elected. Then Linda Harrison spoke. She calmly laid out the case against Patricia's leadership. The tripling of violations and fines during her tenure, the targeting of specific homeowners who challenged her authority, the inflexible enforcement that prioritized appearance over reasonableness, and the recent escalation to filing false complaints with city agencies. "We need an HOA that serves the homeowners, not one that rules over them," Linda said. "We need leadership that can balance maintaining our neighborhood's character with respecting the reality of people's lives. We need to be a community, not a dictatorship." The election results were decisive. Patricia Morrison was voted out, along with Gerald Peterson and Susan Carter. Linda Harrison was elected president. I was elected to the board as secretary, and Dave Kowalski became vice president. Richard Thompson remained as treasurer, and Joyce Miller kept her position as well. Patricia did not take it well. She stood up during the announcement of the results and addressed the room, her voice shaking with anger. "You people are making a huge mistake. Without proper enforcement, this neighborhood will turn into a slum. Property values will plummet. You will regret this." Then she stormed out of the clubhouse, got into her white Lexus, and peeled out of the parking lot. I thought that would be the end of it. Patricia was off the board, we had new leadership, and things could go back to normal. But I was wrong. 3 days after the election, Linda Harrison called an emergency board meeting. Her voice on the phone was serious. "Walter, we have a problem. I have been going through the HOA's financial records, and something is very wrong." The emergency meeting was held at Richard Thompson's house, away from the clubhouse. All 5 board members were present, along with Linda's husband, who was a forensic accountant. Linda spread printouts across Richard's dining room table. I started reviewing our accounts because I wanted to understand our financial position. The HOA collects about $20,000 per month in dues from the 100 houses in the subdivision. That is about $240,000 per year. Plus, we have been collecting thousands in fines, especially over the past 3 years. Richard nodded. "Right, and our expenses are pretty straightforward. We pay for landscaping at the entrance, snow removal, insurance, utilities for the clubhouse, pool maintenance, and general repairs. That usually runs about $15,000 per month." "Exactly. So we should have a substantial reserve fund. HOAs like ours typically maintain reserves equal to about 3 to 6 months of operating expenses." Joyce Miller frowned. "So we should have between $45,000 and $90,000 in reserves, at minimum. But look at our current account balance." She turned a page around so we could all see it. The checking account balance was $12,000. The reserve account showed less than $5,000. That cannot be right, Richard said. I have been treasurer for 2 years and I have been signing checks and approving expenses, but there is no way we have spent that much money. Where did it go? Linda's husband Mark spoke up. That is what I have been trying to figure out. The records are a mess, but there are dozens of payments labeled as management fees and administrative expenses going to something called Meadowbrook Property Services. Those payments total about $35,000 over the past 2 years. What is Meadowbrook Property Services? I asked. That is the thing. I looked it up. It is a property management company registered in Minnesota, but when I dug deeper, the company has only one employee listed on its registration, Patricia Morrison. The room went silent. Richard Thompson's face had gone pale. You are saying Patricia has been paying herself with HOA funds? It looks that way. She apparently set up this company 3 years ago, right around when she became president. Then she started billing the HOA for management services that are not detailed anywhere in our records. Dave Kowalski leaned forward. Is that legal? Can the HOA president hire their own company? Mark shook his head. Not without disclosure and board approval. I reviewed your bylaws. Any contract over $5,000 requires a full board vote, and any contract with a board member or their business requires disclosure and approval by 2/3 of the homeowners. There is no record of either of those things happening. Linda pulled out another set of papers. It gets worse. I found payments to a law firm called Morrison and Associates for legal services. Guess who owns that firm? Patricia's husband, David Morrison. Another $40,000 over the past 3 years. Joyce Miller put her head in her hands. Oh my God. How much are we talking about total, conservatively? About $75,000 that was paid out to companies owned by Patricia or her immediate family without proper authorization or disclosure. That is embezzlement. The word hung in the air like a bomb. Embezzlement was not just an HOA violation or a civil matter. It was a crime. Richard Thompson stood up and started pacing. Okay, we need to be very careful here. These are serious accusations. We need to make absolutely sure we have the facts right before we do anything. Mark gathered his papers. I can do a complete forensic audit. It will take me about a week to go through everything thoroughly. But based on what I have seen so far, I am confident we will find systematic financial misconduct. Do it, Linda said. We need to know the full extent of this before we decide what to do. Over the next 10 days, Mark worked through every financial record the HOA had. He traced every payment, matched every invoice, and documented every discrepancy. What he found was damning. Patricia Morrison had been systematically funneling HOA money into her own pockets for nearly 3 years. The property management company was a shell that provided no actual services. The legal fees were mostly for work that was either unnecessary or never actually performed. She had even charged the HOA for consulting services at a rate of $200 per hour for time she claimed to spend on HOA business, billing up to 20 hours per week. The total amount of money taken was nearly $95,000. We held another board meeting to review Mark's findings. This time, Linda's attorney friend, a woman named Rebecca Chen, joined us. This is absolutely embezzlement, Rebecca said after reviewing the evidence. It is also fraud, theft, and probably a few other charges. You need to report this to the police immediately. Joyce Miller looked sick. Are we sure we want to go that route? I mean, Patricia has a family. This will destroy her life. Linda's expression was hard. She destroyed her own life when she decided to steal from 100 families. She has been taking our money. money that was supposed to maintain our neighborhood and protect our property values, and using it to enrich herself. And while she was doing that, she was aggressively fining people for trivial violations and harassing anyone who questioned her. I have no sympathy. Richard Thompson nodded slowly. Linda is right. We have a fiduciary responsibility to the homeowners. We have to report this. The vote was unanimous. Rebecca Chen contacted the Minneapolis Police Department on our behalf, and 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit came to interview the board later that week. Detective Sarah Martinez and her partner, Detective James Wright, spent 3 hours going through Mark's audit with us. They took copies of all the financial records, the company registration documents, and the unauthorized contracts. "This is pretty clear-cut," Detective Martinez said. "We will need to do our own investigation, but based on what you have shown us, there is probable cause to believe crimes have been committed. We will be contacting Miss Morrison for an interview." "What happens now?" I asked. "We will gather all the evidence, interview her and anyone else involved, and present the case to the county attorney's office. If they agree there is sufficient evidence, they will file charges. The process can take several months, but you have done good work documenting everything. That makes our job much easier." 2 weeks later, Patricia Morrison was arrested at her home and charged with 3 counts of felony theft by swindle and 2 counts of fraud. The story made the local news. Former HOA president arrested for embezzling nearly $100,000 from homeowners association. It was a small story, buried on page 7 of the Metro section, but everyone in Meadowbrook Heights saw it. The aftermath was complicated. The HOA had to hire actual attorneys to deal with the criminal case and to try to recover the stolen money. We had to explain to all the homeowners what had happened and assure them that the new board was implementing proper financial controls to prevent anything like this from happening again. We also had to deal with Patricia's supporters, who initially insisted she was innocent and that this was all a vendetta by people who disagreed with her enforcement policies. But as more details came out, even her strongest supporters had to acknowledge the evidence was overwhelming. The legal process took nearly a year. Patricia's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the county attorney was not interested. The case went to trial in February of the following year. I was called to testify about the ICE tape violations and Patricia's pattern of harassment, which established her motive and demonstrated how she abused her authority. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia Morrison was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $95,000 plus interest. Her husband David was also charged with conspiracy and received 2 years of probation and community service for his role in accepting the fraudulent legal fee payments. Through all of this, I kept the heat tape installed on my house through that second winter. It worked perfectly, preventing any ice buildup and keeping my eaves clear. Several other homeowners in the neighborhood installed their own heat tape systems, and the new board quickly updated the architectural guidelines to explicitly allow them as a seasonal weather protection measure. Linda Harrison turned out to be an excellent HOA president. She implemented new policies that focused on actual safety and maintenance issues rather than petty aesthetic complaints. The number of violation notices dropped by 70%, but the neighborhood actually looked better because people felt like they were part of a community rather than living under a dictatorship. The HOA recovered about $60,000 of the embezzled money through seizure of Patricia's assets and her restitution payments. It was not the full amount, but combined with better financial management under Richard Thompson's oversight, we were able to rebuild the reserve fund and even reduce monthly HOA fees by 15%. As for me, I served on the board for 2 years before stepping down to focus on other things. The experience taught me a lot about standing up for what is right, the importance of knowing your rights, and how even small community organizations can become corrupt when people are not paying attention. I also learned that sometimes the most effective act of resistance is simply refusing to be unreasonable. Patricia Morrison's downfall was not really about the heat tape or the ICE violations. It was about a pattern of abuse of power that became unsustainable once people stopped being afraid and started demanding accountability. On a cold day in January, nearly 3 years after the whole thing started, I was outside checking my heat tape installation before a predicted snowstorm. My neighbor Dave Kowalski walked over with a cup of coffee. "Hard to believe it has been 3 years since all that craziness," he said. "I know. Feels like a lifetime ago. You ever regret fighting back? I mean, you could have just paid the fines and moved on with your life." I thought about it for a moment, watching the heat cable running along my eaves, ready to do its job when the snow came. "No," I said finally. "Some things are worth fighting for. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when it is easier not to. And sometimes the little battles matter just as much as the big ones." Dave raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To fighting the good fight." "To fighting the good fight," I agreed. That night the snow came. By morning there were 6 inches of fresh powder covering everything. My heat tape did its job perfectly, keeping the eaves clear and preventing any ice buildup. All through the neighborhood, houses with and without heat tape stood side by side, each homeowner making their own choices about how to protect their property, without fear of arbitrary fines or harassment. It was exactly how a neighborhood should work. People living their lives, maintaining their homes, and treating each other with respect and reasonableness. Patricia Morrison had tried to turn Meadowbrook Heights into her personal fiefdom, but in the end, the community had taken it back. The heat tape stayed up through the winter, came down in the spring, and went back up the following fall, just as it was designed to do. Simple, practical, effective. Sometimes the right solution is the obvious one, regardless of what anyone else thinks about how it looks. And if there was one lesson I took away from the whole experience, it was this: read your HOA covenants before you buy a house. Pay attention to who is running your community organizations, and never be afraid to ask questions when something does not make sense. The people in charge only have as much power as you give them, and accountability only exists when people are willing to demand it. 3 years later, Meadowbrook Heights was a genuinely better place to live. Property values had actually gone up, not because of strict enforcement of petty rules, but because people wanted to live in a neighborhood where they were treated like adults and given reasonable flexibility to maintain their homes. Funny how that works. I still see Patricia Morrison's house sometimes when I drive past. It sits empty now, foreclosed after she could no longer make the payments from prison. There is a "for sale" sign in the yard, faded and weathered from months of exposure. The eaves have ice hanging from them every winter, long, dangerous icicles that nobody bothers to address because there is nobody living there to care. It is a fitting reminder that the standards she claimed to care so much about were never really the point. The point was control, power, and money. And in the end, that house stands as a monument to what happens when you forget that being part of a community means serving others, not ruling over them. As for my house, it looks great. The paint is fresh, the lawn is maintained, and every winter, those practical black heat cables do their job without complaint. They are not pretty, but they are honest and they work. Sometimes that is all that matters.